Hey business technology students, and welcome to video 6 where we're going to go from ledgers to trial balances using computerized accounting software. In this case it's just Excel. We're not going to be using the fancy MYOB or Xero because they skip the ledger posting step. So we're just going to be using some Excel to post to ledgers and then summarize those ledgers in a trial balance. Planning on going over the natures of classifications first, which everybody should have down by now. If you don't, then I'm going to suggest some homework. From there, we'll move on to the purpose of ledgers, discuss a couple of different ways you can lay out your ledgers, and give you a really useful methodical strategy for posting to them. Afterwards, after you follow this strategy, you should find ledgers to be very easy, very boring, and something that you don't really have to think much for, but very easy. Trial balances, even easier. We'll start with the purpose and then discuss how to complete one. Finally, and the most important part is we need to identify if there's any errors in that trial balance, and we'll discuss some strategies for how to fix them if you do find them. So that first thing we're going to talk about is the natures of accounts. So if you can't do this from memory at this point, then what you need to do is set yourself the homework of doing this once or twice a day for the next couple of weeks. If you do that, then you won't have any problems with accounting for the rest of your studies with it. So this really is the key to becoming an accountant. If you don't remember this table, then you can't progress any further. Alright, so what type of accounts do we have? We have 5 different options, starting with assets. Now, as soon as you get assets down, the next thing to put down is the opposite of an asset, which is a liability. A lot of people at this point think to themselves about income coming in, so revenue, and then the opposite of revenue, and then finally owner's equity. Alright, now I just want to bring these all back to singular so I'm consistent. Okay. Once you've got them out, however you want to memorize it, there's a lot of different techniques. Some teachers suggest a mnemonic like RIELO here, which, if you have a look at it, it's revenue, expense, asset, liability, owner's equity. So that's another way you can memorize these. Once you get to filling out the nature column, you only need to remember 2 of them. So assets and expenses both have a debit nature. So they should just go in instantly from your memory, and then you know the others must be the opposite of that. Okay, now the increase column, you need to remember for that to increase, do the same as nature. Which means, to fill out the increase column, all I really need to do is copy and paste my nature column. Alright, now for the decrease column, I think you can guess what we're going to do here. To decrease, do the opposite of nature. Alright, so once you can do that from memory, continue the practice of completing it until you can do it extremely quickly, until the natures, the increases and the decreases become second nature to you. You should be able to answer if someone says to you, how do I increase the bank account? Your brain should immediately jump to this line, and then it should jump to cell C2 here. We would debit it. If someone says, how do I increase drawings? Well, you would jump straight down to equity. But then you would have to recognize that drawings is contra equity, so it's pretty well going to be the opposite of what we're seeing here, your answer to it. In order to increase your drawings account, you would have to debit it. Okay, so after you have got this memorized, the next thing that we're going to be talking about are ledgers. So I've got some general journal entries over on the side here. First thing I just want to point out is when you are doing a general journal, do not write in brackets after the account what classification it is. The reason they've done that is just to help you with your postings here and for a learning purpose. Don't get in the habit of doing that. Alright, now the next thing we're going to discuss is the point of a ledger. If I zoom out a little bit on this document, we'll see general ledgers over to the side here. Each general ledger has an account name up the top, so cash at bank, equipment, accounts payable, so on. And the aim of a general ledger is to summarize all the transactions within that particular account. Otherwise, we have our journal, yes, but if someone asked you what was the total increase to our cash at bank account, it would be very annoying to have to go through the ledger and add up all of the debits to cash at bank. Much easier to have them all in a ledger, and then it is summarized, and you can just glance at it to answer that question. Alright, let's take a look at a couple of the different layouts that you will see when you are dealing with general ledgers. The first one is the columnar layout. That's what I'm in at the moment. And the columnar layout is what you will typically see in all of your computerized accounting programs. It is certainly the modern layout, but it does pay to know both, because there are plenty of people who still use T accounts as well, and lots of people who prefer them. So it's going to be up to you to decide which one you do prefer, but you need to be able to use both. The columnar layout has, as I said, the accounts split like this in the general ledger, and then each line is a new transaction. We have a running balance going down the right-hand side. So increases to cash at bank will increase the balance, decreases will bring it down. The T account layout looks very similar. We still have the accounts split up like that, but we have everything duplicated. So I'm going to make this a thick box border, and this one a thick box border, just to differentiate between the two halves. This left side is the debit side of the T account. This right side is the credit side. So what you do is, if it's a debit, it's on the left. If it's a credit, it's on the right. There's a couple of other things that need to be done as a process in order to work out closing balances when you're dealing with a T account ledger, which we'll talk about soon. But for now, that is enough of a difference. The fact that it is split on left and right versus having this running balance column. Let's look at a posting strategy for a columnar ledger. And the number one tip here is to be methodical. You need to follow a pattern and be very consistent with that. So my suggested pattern is start by choosing an account from the list of your general journal lines. Now here we go, the first general journal line is cash at bank. So I'm going to do this cash at bank ledger as my first transaction. Step 2, it says find the corresponding general ledger. Well, here's my corresponding general ledger. Step 3, input the date of the first transaction to that account. We're given the date here as the 25th of the 1st. So instead of typing it again, I'm going to utilize good Excel practices by a reference. Step 4, input the dollar amount and the folio. So the dollar amount for this particular line is 220 as a debit. So I'm going to click in the debit column here, equals 220, enter. And the folio. Now the folio is which journal did we post this from? And if you go back and have a look at the journal and the title of it, it was the general journal. So I'm going to put GJ here. If it was the cash receipts journal, you'd see something like this, or cash payments journal, or sales journal, but this time it's general journal. Okay, so what's my next step? Input the details, so this column here, as the other side of the journal. This is where people tend to get a little bit confused. So this is the line that I'm currently entering. What would the other side of that journal be? Well, we've got two lines underneath it. Sales and GST collected. The way to think about this is think of the details column here as being the why. Why did the cash at bank account get debited for $220? What business event occurred that increased our bank account's balance? Well, if I put GST collected here, it would not be helpful for anybody. It would be as if, for no reason at all, we've collected GST. And that's why we collected $220 into the bank account. It makes much more sense to have sales in here. All right, now there's another reason not to put things like revenue account after your general journal entries. It just looks much nicer if it's not there. So I have put the other side of the journal. In this case, it was the sales line as the Y behind this increase, this debit of 220 for cash at bank. So as long as you are methodical like that, then you shouldn't have any problems with ledgers at all. Now, I have finished step 5 here. My suggestion for step 6 is this balance here, you can wait until you've completed all of one particular general ledger before you do the balance, and I will be doing that shortly. But now that I have posted this first line, I'm going to tick it off. I'm going to make sure that I don't post it a second time. I'm happy with what I've done. Okay, I'm going to look for any other cash at bank lines. Here we go, here's one here. So that's the next thing I'm going to do. So back to the first step. I've already chosen my account. I've already found the corresponding general ledger. Step 3, input the date of that transaction. So that's the 27th. I shouldn't be typing it, I should just refer to it. Okay, the next thing was the amount, and in this case we have a credit of 1,100. And the folio is again the general journal. Okay, and then input details is the other side of the journal. What was the other side of the journal for this particular thing? Why did our cash at bank go down for 1,100? Well, we paid rent. Okay, rent paid is my details for that one. Any other cash at bank lines? Yes, right here we have another one where we have deposited money into the cash at bank. The owner has done the deposit, so it's the capital account that is being credited. Alright, so let's post. Oh, one thing I did forget to do, I forgot to highlight that I had done this line. And now I've got to do the date, the amount, which is a debit of 3,000. General journal is my folio. I can just refer to above. And then it was because of capital. Okay, so that's all of the cash at bank done. Finally, I'm going to do my balance. Now, there's a few different ways to do this. You could, of course, use a calculator, or you could do something quite manual where you could say, okay, well, the balance here is 220. And then it gets reduced by 1,100, and then it increases by 3,000. And that's okay, but it's not the ideal formula. The ideal formula will be flexible, and it will be flexible enough that I can change this debit to a credit, and the balance will update correctly. So the only way to do that is, for this first one, we go equals the debit side minus the credit side. And I know there's nothing in the credit side now, but if this was a credit for 220 instead, then it has corrected to a negative 220. So the formula is flexible there. In this next one, I need to start with whatever my previous balance was, and it's whited out at the moment because the rows are a little bit small. But once I've got that 220 from above, I add on any increases for this particular row. I subtract any decreases for this particular row. Right, now that formula is even better than the first one, because what it will do is it will allow me to drag this formula down, and that will update for any further transactions. I can see that by dragging it down, it's now doing the previous balance, increase for debit, decrease for credit. The only thing I would do differently there is when you're dragging this one down to use autofill, drag with right click instead of left click, and it gives you an option to fill without formatting. That way it doesn't stuff up all of your rows that have been drawn, keeps everything looking neat, but it still drags the formula down. So that's columnar, and before we go on to the same thing but the T account format, take note of the balance. Quite important to remember that our closing balance here is 2120. So we'll be methodical as usual. We're going to start with cash at bank, and it's pretty similar to what we did the first time, just remembering that the left side of this ledger is debit and the right side here is credit. So I'll put the date in first, and then I'm going to put in the amount, which was 220 as a debit, and the folio is the general journal. Details are going to be the other side of this journal, that's sales, or the why of why we are increasing cash at bank. And that was we made a sale. And that is that first one posted, so I can green that one. Alright, where is the next cash at bank? Here we go, it's rent paid. Now in this case I have to remember that this is a credit. So it's extremely important I don't put it on this debit side, I have to make sure it's over here on the credit side. We go equals and put the date in. Then I'm going to put the amount in. Then the folio is the general journal. And it was because of rent. Okay, I'm going to tick off the cash at bank line. And look for my last one. This time it's capital. We are increasing cash at bank because of capital. So how do I increase the cash at bank ledger? Well, that's a debit. So I'm going to post it on the debit side here. Put the date in first. Then the amount we increased cash at bank by. It was from the general journal. And it was because of capital. Okay, going to green the capital line. Sorry, not the capital line, the cash at bank line. That was almost a fatal error. I haven't posted the capital line yet. That goes over in the capital general ledger. Okay, so there's all my cash at bank done. Instantly, there is a bit of a problem. I don't know what my balance is. Not without doing some maths. If I look back at my columnar ledger, remember 2,120 was the balance. I can't see that instantly over here. So what you need to do when you want to know the balance of a T ledger account is, and typically at the end of the month you're going to want to know these balances, what you need to do is balance the ledger. Now at the moment, if I do a sum on the debit side, it's 3,220. A sum on the credit side is 1,100. So to balance this off, what I need to do is at the, let's say the 31st, at the end of the month, I'm going to balance it. And the terminology to use for this line is called balance CD. As I've written over in step 6 here, when you finished all the postings, balance each ledger. The balance carried down at the end of the month becomes the balance brought down for the next month. Alright, now we'll talk about brought down in a second. Let's just finish off the carried down. Now, the way to work this out is to balance the sides. Now, I need to have something in this credit side so that it equals the debit side. And the way to calculate that is to do, well, whatever the debit side sum is here, minus whatever the credit side sum is. And now that I've put that in, you can see they equal each other. So my debits equal my credits. That's my balance carried down. And hopefully that figure rings a bell too. If we go back and look at columnar, that was the closing balance of the cash at bank here, 2,120. So here we have 2,120. Now, the next month, at the beginning of the next month, we put the date, and then we put balance brought down, and we refer back to the carried down ending figure here. We can get rid of these little sums down the bottom now. So that is how you balance off a T-ledger account. It does tend to confuse people because they're not sure why we have a balance carried down over on the credit side of the journal of 2,120. Well, the reason for that is all you're doing here is a working step. This is just a step towards calculating this, the balance brought down. That is the final figure, that's on the debit side, and that's the important thing. This is just a working step which facilitates you subtracting one side of the ledger from the other side, and this is the important part here. Alright, now whatever you prefer, be it columnar or T account, make sure you are comfortable with both of them because you will see them all the time. On to trial balances. Once you have posted all of your general ledgers, be it to columnar or T account, or both if you're doing a practice, the next step is completing a trial balance. And the point of completing a trial balance is to make sure you have posted everything correctly to your columnar and T account ledgers. The most important thing is that the sum of all of the debits that you posted equals the sum of all of the credits. And it should make sense to you if you recognize that when we did our journal, the most important thing to check is for each journal, do the debits, in this case 220, equal the credits. If you add them up, 220. That logic stays true for every single journal entry that was posted here. So when we took all of these and posted them over to our general ledgers, that had to stay true. Now, it won't always be that all the debits and all the credits in each account are the same, because that would result in a zero balance for every account. That wouldn't make any sense. But if you add up all of the debits and all of the credits, they should sum up to equal the same thing. So that's the point of our trial balance. We need to make sure we've posted to the ledger correctly, so that when we produce our financial reports, there aren't any glaring mistakes where we've lost some figures along the way. This particular task gives some good steps. It says complete a trial balance from both the columnar and the T-format ledgers. In order to do that though, fortunately the columnar ledgers we have been given balances, but for the T-ledger accounts we have not been given the balances. So you will have to do the balance CD, balance BD process in order to work out those balances. Might be annoying, but as it is the trickiest part of T-format ledgers, it is excellent to practice it. We need to create two identical trial balances, so we'll use this one for columnar, this one for T-ledger, and make sure they're exactly the same. So how do we post to a trial balance? Now that we've talked about the point of it, how do we actually do it? Well, all you need to do is have a look at the account name and put that in as your first account here, so cash at bank. Ideally we'd use a reference in this case to click back up here, but that causes a problem in this case because of the way this Excel spreadsheet's been set up to have account name and cash at bank in the same cell. So I will have to type that manually, unfortunately. Then all I need to do is look at my balance. So in this case, the balance is 2120 as a debit. So I'm going to go equals and click on this. Now, these answers have been automatically generated. I don't particularly like the way that they have typed this in manually and then used text afterwards for debit credit. But to each their own, that's fine. I will need to make this a little bit bigger so I can see everything. The problem with having that as text is if I try to say, let's just times this by 10. It's not going to work because it doesn't recognize this as a number. So ideally, in your answers, you won't have the debit credit thing like this. Instead, you will have it looking more like this. So I've just taken that from the exercise we did back on the columnar tab. Okay, so then all I need to do is I've got cash at bank here. I can go equals here and then click on 2120 as my final balance in the debit column. I know it's a debit because it's a positive figure and cash at bank has a debit nature. If it was a negative figure, I would know it's the opposite of the nature, so I would have to move this over to the credit side. So see how easy that was. We've done all the hard work, we've done all the heavy lifting when we posted it to the general ledger. The next account is equipment, and that has a $15,000 debit balance. So I put it in on the debit side. Continue that process with each one of these ledgers. Ideally, have a methodical step to it. So after you post one of these, might be a good idea just to indicate that you've posted it. So maybe green a little cell next to it like I've done here, to make sure you don't double post things. And here is my finished trial balance. So the first thing that we need to check is, do our debits equal our credits? Oh, there's a problem. So I've intentionally put a mistake in here because this is the most common situation to be in, particularly for some reason at the end of an exam. This is just where you're very likely to end up, and it's not a good place to be because it's very rare that at the end of an exam you know for a fact that you've done something wrong. So there's an issue here. What strategies can we employ to find it? Alright, and here are two different approaches which can be effective at quickly finding when you have one or more mistakes. So the second one here is only useful if you have one mistake. If you've only made one mistake, this is very, very useful. Now, let's give it a go. So it says calculate the difference between the debits and the credits. divide whatever the difference is by 2, and then look for both numbers back up here in your general ledger or down here in your trial balance. Sometimes I can give you a clue. So let's try that one. I'm going to calculate the difference between the debits and the credits, and it ends up being $748. That divided by 2 is 374. Remember both of those numbers, 748, 374, and then scan through here. Can you see 748 or 374? Or instantly I can see 374. So that is an indicator to me that maybe there's a mistake here. Also, if I go back up here, I'm looking for 748 or 374. There is only 374 and it is in accounts payable. So that is the first way to look for a mistake. And I can see that my error is, if I look back at accounts payable, it is a credit with a balance in a credit, but down here I have it in the debit column. So that's the error I've made. Now, what if you've made more than one mistake? So I've changed things around that I've now made more than one mistake. I can attempt number 2 here, where I do credit minus debit, divide that by 2, and then have a look around for those figures. But I'm not going to find them anywhere, because my problem is the sum of more than one mistake. So I won't find the answer in one figure. So that's not going to be helpful this time. So what can we do then? We'll have a look at number 1 here. Check each line in the trial balance is the same as its nature. What this is going to detect is whether or not I have posted from the general ledger to the trial balance correctly. Alright, so we have assets, another asset, a liability, another liability, an expense. This one here, I'm going to call it an asset, only for, have a chat with your teacher if you're not sure why. Bank loan, liability, equity, revenue, and expense. So the nature of an asset is a debit, and it's on the debit side, so good. Now, it won't always be on the debit side if it's an asset. For example, perhaps we have withdrawn more than we owned from the bank account. It could be an overdraft, in which case it would make sense for it to be on the credit side. But this is just a good check for easy mistakes. Equipment is a debit because it's an asset. Liabilities, they are generally a credit. I've got it on the debit side, so I need to go back and have a look. Accounts payable, here we go. It's a credit only, so it should be a credit balance. There's my first mistake. I'll fix that one up now. GST collected, liability, credit, good. Debit for expenses. Assets should be debits. So let's check that one, GST paid. We have debit, debit, and debit, which means the balance here should be a debit. I've made a mistake by putting it on the wrong side down here, so I'm going to fix that one up. Equals, and there we go. I'm back in a balancing situation. So both of these will help you detect if you have put debits when it should be credits or credits when it should be debits. They really only help you, though, if you are checking for posting errors from the ledger to the trial balance. If you have tried both of step 1 and step 2, the only thing left to you is step 3, which is do another methodical recheck, starting from the very beginning. Now look at my current situation. I've got my totals not equaling each other. They're slightly out, $1. I can try the first step, and I can see that, yes, all my assets are debits, my liabilities are credits, my expenses are debits, my equities are credits, and my revenues are credits. So that's fine. I've checked my step 1. For step 2, the difference between debit and credit is $1. Dividing by 2 gives me 50 cents. I can't see those numbers anywhere here, so that's not helpful. And what it means is my mistake goes deeper than just the last step. So the last step we did was posting the sum of our general ledgers to the trial balance. If you make a mistake during that step, it's not too bad. If you made a mistake earlier, say perhaps all the way back when you were drafting your general journals, that mistake will have flowed through to the trial balance, and that's what's currently happened here. The only thing we can do to detect what went wrong is starting again. Now, the good news is, I know for a fact there's a mistake. When you're in Excel, I should add a fourth step here, which is check your formulas. Make sure that the sum formulas are grabbing every single number, because that is a very common issue. But if you're just doing your manual accounting, then what we need to do is head back to our original ledgers, our journals, and make sure we've drafted them correctly. Check that debits equal credits on each journal. And in this case, I've just added all of those up. My debits definitely equal my credits. So I've gone back and I've checked the very beginning of the entire accounting process. I've checked the general journals. There's no mistake there. What was the next step? When you finished the general journal, what did you do? You posted to the ledger. So I've hidden my ledgers that were on this page because I didn't use them for my trial balance. I used these ledgers here. What I need to do is make sure that each line, every single line, has been posted correctly over to the ledgers. That's the next step. So I'll undo all of my green, which indicates that I had posted it, and I'll begin that process again. Now I'm just going to pause the video while I do that. Alright, it took a little while, about 5 minutes, but I have worked my way down to the problem. This line here, there's a mistake in my posting. So I'll show you what it is. Cash at bank, asset, and we have credited for 1,100. If I go over to my trial balance, find my cash at bank general ledger, here is my credit. Look what figure I've got there. Instead of 1,100, I've got $1,101. So to fix this, then all I need to do is fix that up to 1,100. And this wouldn't have been a mistake, by the way, if I'd done my Excel correctly. If I had just pressed equals and referred back to 1,100, I couldn't possibly have made that error. Alright, so 1,100 is the answer there. Now if I look back at my trial balance, I can see it is fixed. So if step 1 and 2, if the quick fixes don't work, it means that there is a deeper error, probably going back to your journals. So head back there, check every journal balances, check every account is correct there, and then check all of your postings to the ledger, and then you should have found it at that point.